Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, what are the differences between the major mental health professions, right? So individuals who deliver talk therapy, like counselors, social workers, psychologists, marriage and family therapists. Another question I've heard here is, which one is the best? Which of course is really impossible to answer, but I have heard this question, and I've heard it from the perspective of from a client, like which one is the best for a client, and which one is the best in terms of being that professional, like which career is most satisfying, or which career can yield the most financial opportunities. So again, the word best is subjective, but I am going to try to talk about the differences between these different professions. And keep in mind that I am a counselor educator. I have a Ph.D. in counselor education and supervision. So my bias, of course, is going to be toward my own profession. I'm going to try to control that as best as I can, but it's just important to know that information. Now, to kind of get this started, it's important to recognize that these different professions, just saying the name of a profession, like saying somebody's a counselor or a social worker, doesn't necessarily give you a lot of information because there's different types within each profession. So this can get pretty confusing pretty quickly. We do know certain things about a person if they identify themselves as a marriage and family therapist or a psychologist or whatever, but there's a limit, again, because of all the diversity within each profession. So for example, with counseling, we see mental health counselors, career counselors, addiction counselors, marriage counselors, as well as many other types of counselor. We also see that some counselors have a master's degree. I would say most by far do, and some have Ph.D.s, like me. It's really very similar for marriage and family therapy in this respect. We see a few different types here with MFTs, and we also see master's and doctoral level MFTs. Now with social workers, there are non-clinical social workers out there. So some have a bachelor's degree and can get licensed at that level, but these social workers would not deliver therapy. And we also see LCSWs, licensed clinical social workers, who of course can deliver therapy. And these would usually be individuals with a master's degree in social work, but sometimes a Ph.D. Now with psychology, we also see different types of psychologists. We see counseling psychologists, clinical psychologists, experimental psychologists. So experimental would be psychologists that conduct research. We also see that with psychology, you have Ph.D. psychologists and PsyD psychologist. So there is a master's degree in psychology available, and some individuals with this degree can get licensed in certain jurisdictions, but generally, as I indicated, psychologists either have a Ph.D. or a PsyD. And I'll talk a little bit more about education in a moment. So all the mental health professionals I've talked about can potentially offer therapy. But sometimes members within this profession, like an individual member, may not do that, right? There are other roles in these professions, like supervisors, administrators, consultants, and researchers. So somebody may be qualified to deliver psychotherapy, but not do that because it's not part of their job. So now moving to education, what type of education does it take to become one of these different professionals, like for each of these professional identities? Well, for counseling, social work, and marriage and family therapy at the level where somebody can deliver therapy, and I'm really including that part specifically for social work, it requires a master's degree in most places, and usually this master's degree would have 60 credits. Now again, there's variation from state to state, but that's mostly what we're seeing now, 60 credit master's degree. Now for psychology, as I indicated, it would either be a Ph.D. or a PsyD, and these two different doctorates are mostly similar, but the Ph.D. has a research and statistics emphasis, and the PsyD has an emphasis on clinical work, so sitting with clients and delivering therapy. Now in terms of which professions have the most members, there's not a lot of good data on this, but if we look at all of the mental health professionals together, so this would include psychiatry and other professionals, we see that about 37% of professionals are counselors, about 29% are social workers, 16% are psychologists, 7% are marriage and family therapists, And if we look at psychiatry, we would see about 9% of the professionals are psychiatrists, and about 2% fall into another category. So this is by the number of professionals and not by the hours that are billed. So in general, just looking at this, we can see there appear to be more counselors than any other single profession, but we also see that social work is fairly popular too. And of course, psychologists require a Ph.D. or Psych.D., so it makes sense that there would be fewer psychologists. I'm not sure why there's fewer marriage and family therapists. This is just, I think, a function of how that profession formed and the interest level in that profession. And of course, to be a psychiatrist, that requires a medical degree, so that would be more difficult to get, so it makes sense there would be fewer psychiatrists as well. So taking a look at a quick history of these different professions, and the dates are a little fuzzy here because some people recognize different events in each profession as important, and professional associations open and close and all this, but in general, here's kind of a quick history of each of the professions. So the counseling profession, it started in the early 1900s as career counseling, but counselors took a long time to organize and be recognized as a distinct identity to form their profession. The first professional association for counseling was formed in 1952, and the first license was issued in the state of Virginia in 1976. So counseling is an old profession, but again, it wasn't until later on that they kind of got organized and started identifying with certain characteristics, like their emphasis on wellness and development through the lifespan and all that. So looking at social work, we see here that social work also originated in the early 1900s, but they formed their identity much sooner. Their first professional association was formed in 1918, and they really were recognized formally sometime in the early 1930s. Of course, there were social workers before that, but their formal recognition. So their profession is much older than the profession of counseling in the sense of when they formally organized. Moving to psychology, we see psychology is the oldest profession of all the professions I'll be discussing here. It formed in the late 1800s. Their oldest professional association, which is still the current professional association, the American Psychological Association, was founded in 1892. So we see that a lot of the other professions kind of took pieces of psychology and broke off and formed identities, and they also had pieces from other disciplines. So psychology really, again, the oldest profession, and we see the influences of psychology in all the professions. Looking at marriage and family therapy, interestingly, this profession also started in the early 1900s, and their first association, professional association, was formed in 1942. So their profession goes back a ways, but like I mentioned, there aren't many marriage and family therapists as compared to the other professions I'm talking about here today. Now, with all these professionals, licenses are available in every jurisdiction, in every state. So there are differences between the professions, but every profession can get a professional license. Any member of that profession with the right training and supervision and experience can get a professional license. So how about this question, what is the best? Which one of these is the best? As I mentioned before, this is really tough to answer, and I can't really answer it directly, but I can talk about some of the differences and areas where I think certain professions have an advantage. So this really comes down to, like, how do you choose which type of professional that you would need? They all conduct psychotherapy, they all diagnose, so in that sense, it doesn't really matter. But there are differences in training and identity which may matter under certain circumstances. So kind of the common answer I hear to the question, how do I choose which professional to go to, is, well, go to somebody who's a good fit for you. I hear this all the time. It's about the fit between the counselor or other professional and the client. Now, this is a good answer, but it doesn't really tell you what each profession does in general. It doesn't really give you an idea of where to start. So to use an example from like the legal profession, so if somebody said, what type of attorney should I choose for a certain situation, you wouldn't just say, well, find the one who's a good match for you in terms of personality or whatever. You'd have to actually find someone who practices that type of law. If someone has been accused of a crime, they wouldn't necessarily want like a tax attorney or like a real estate attorney, right? So it does matter what training that attorney would have. Now, with the world of law, of course, those different areas of specialty are really distinguished quite well. In the mental health professions, they aren't distinguished quite as well. But I'm really just trying to illustrate that the answer of, just go to the person that you fit the best with doesn't help for guiding somebody toward therapy. It doesn't help too well. So let's take a look here at these professions, and I'll give you kind of the areas where I think they're strong and situations where they might be a better choice over the other professions. Again, it's important to recognize that all of them treat mental disorders. So if there's no circumstances that really stand out, then any one of these professions may be fine for treatment. Now, I'm going to change the order when I list these professions now, talking about this, because again, I am a counselor and I'm concerned that I'd be biased toward my own profession, so I'm going to save them to the end. I'm going to start with social work, move to psychology, marriage and family therapy, and then talk about counselors. So social workers tend to emphasize external problems. So if somebody needs a connection to social services like transportation, food, or shelter, I think being treated by a social worker really makes sense. Social workers really know the system pretty well. They're well versed in how to maneuver through the system and get an individual connected with the services that they need. Again, that's not the only thing they can do, but if I'm to look at something about that profession and say what really stands out as a strength, that would be what stands out. I know a number of counselors that actually call social workers when they're trying to find clients like shelter or like bus passes or something like that, because social workers just know that system so well. Now, taking a look at psychology, the real strengths when you look at that profession would be formal appraisal. So using psychometric tests in like a written report that can document what's going on with somebody in terms of mental health symptoms or personality. So psychologists are usually a good choice if someone's involved in like a court situation, like a custody battle or a criminal case. Like if somebody commits a crime and they go to a defense attorney, the defense attorney might say, well, go to a psychologist and get a formal appraisal because some of the mental health symptoms might explain what happened in terms of the criminal behavior. So it might be helpful in the defense. Now, I know that there are other Ph.D.s that do this as well, like some Ph.D. counselor educators are into psychometric assessment. But again, in general, this is an area where psychologists have a lot of strengths. Now, looking at marriage and family therapy is pretty interesting. They focus on relational dynamics. So if somebody's having a problem in a marriage, in their family situation, raising children, really fitting into a social system, this is where marriage and family therapists seem to have the most training and emphasis. So how you fit into a family system, how you can make changes in the system, and that could affect the individual. They really have kind of a non-traditional perspective and approach. Like their methods really stand out among the professions as being quite different. And I don't mean this in a bad way. They're just more focused on like systems theory as opposed to the traditional methods of like internal change that we see with like counseling, for example. So marriage and family therapy, I think, is a good choice when you're looking at relational dynamics. So how about the last profession I'll talk about, which is counseling? Well, counselors really focus on internal change. So if somebody comes in with mental health symptoms or they want to change certain personality characteristics, a counselor is going to talk about what that person can do internally, not so much systems and not so much the external environment in general. They focus on development through the lifespan and stages, like if somebody's going to college, that's a big change. If they're getting their first like real job, if they're getting married, having children, if they're looking to like develop their career, all these really speak to like changes, like stages that change in somebody's life, and counselors are pretty good at addressing those types of changes. Of course, if somebody's interested in any type of career advice, counselors, I think, make the most sense for that because that's a specialty for counseling. And counselors also take kind of a holistic view and a wellness model when they approach clinical situations. So those are the different professions and kind of their areas of strength. But again, all the professions can provide therapy. And I think under certain situations, any one of these professions would be appropriate for really a wide variety of situations that a client could be struggling with. So this discussion so far has been from the client's point of view. So if somebody has a mental disorder or they have certain goals that could be met by therapy and they're looking at the professions. But what about the potential professional point of view? What about somebody looking at like educational programs and they're thinking, well, I don't know what kind of career I want to get into. Should I choose social work or psychology? Well, I like all the different professions, but for different reasons. And you really have to think about what you want to do as a professional. If you want to work in forensic and court settings, I think psychology makes sense. If you want to work at like a hospital and large agencies and not necessarily have a direct clinical role, like if you're interested in other types of roles, like connecting people with services, I think social work makes sense. Counselors also work in hospitals and, of course, forensic and court settings. But counseling's, I think, a better choice when you really want to be face-to-face with a client in like a private practice setting or just an outpatient setting in general. Counselors also run groups and deliver other types of therapy, but mostly that's what we think of when we think of a counseling professional. I like counseling because you can be licensed at the master's level, and if you want to get a Ph.D., you can do that later on. So like with psychology, you can't do that. You kind of have to commit from the beginning and kind of follow it through. And I think a lot of the advantages I talk about with counseling are really there for marriage and family therapy as well. As I mentioned before, they're just a smaller profession, and I tend to see them kind of more associated with family agencies, like state agencies, and private practice. But again, they can do a lot of different types of jobs. So from the professional point of view, you really have to look at all these professions and think, what do I want to do, and which one of these career paths makes the most sense? Which one lines up the best? The nice part is if you choose the wrong one, I'm not sure that always really matters too much. So if counseling would have been the right profession for you, but you chose marriage and family therapy, you can still do a lot of the same things that counselors do. If it turns out that psychology really would have been a better choice and you chose counseling, the same thing. Counselors can use assessments, they can diagnose. So I think that it's wise to try to pick the right profession that matches, but not to get too caught up in terms of like, whoa, I think I chose the wrong one, and now I'm destined to be doing work that I don't want to do. That's not necessarily the case. There's a lot of flexibility with all these different mental health professions. So the last item I'll cover here is which profession pays the best. Now, this is not usually the first thing we think of when we think of mental health professions, like the helping professions, but I know this matters, right? It is important to be compensated for what you do, and you have to make a living. I would say that it highly depends on the job, but in general, a Ph.D. is going to pay better than a master's degree. So that's something to keep in mind, whether it's counselor education or psychology or the other professions. Now, at the master's level, I think the professions are largely equal. I think a PsyD, which is of course a doctoral level, a PsyD psychologist might make a little bit more than a master's level. Like sometimes they can bill insurance companies more, like they're reimbursed more from insurance companies. But in general, I don't see a big difference between the PsyD and like a master's level counselor or social worker in terms of money. So I would say for the non-PhD professionals, it usually works out somewhat close to the same in terms of compensation. Again, can't emphasize enough, it really depends on the job though. So some jobs just pay more than others regardless of what the professional identity is. So I know whenever I talk about like professional identity and which profession is the best in these types of questions, there are going to be a lot of different opinions. Some people will agree and disagree with me. And I think that's great. And I want you to put those opinions in the comments section because I really know the most about counseling. I know a lot of information about the other professions, but not as much as those professionals would know, right? So it makes sense that I would be biased toward my profession and really not have all the knowledge about the other professionals that those people would have. So if you have a different perspective on what, well, even what counselors do, but also what psychologists, social workers, and marriage family therapists do, please put those in the comments as well. I'd really like to see that, and I think it would generate an interesting dialogue about how the mental health professionals are similar and how they're different. I hope you found this description of which mental health professional identity is the best and what are the differences between the professions to be interesting. Thanks for watching.